So nice to meet you all. My name is Moshe Zeldman. I live in Jerusalem with my wife, Malka. She came to join me. We're on a date night in Tel Aviv, so she came along tonight. She didn't come for the science and Torah class. She can get that anytime. Yes, let me just give you my own background a little bit before we get into the specifics. I grew up in Toronto, Canada. Any Canadians here? No? Okay. Grew up in Toronto, Canada. So I can say nasty things about Canada. Nobody will be offended. That's fine. I didn't come from a religious home. I grew up in a pretty secular environment. Went to university. I was doing my degree in an area called artificial intelligence. That's mainly what I was studying, which is more of a philosophy/science program. And the main focus is really understanding the question of how our minds work, how our brains work, and how that compares to how a computer works, how computers calculate things. I was approaching it just out of academic interest. I thought it was a fascinating topic. Can you get a computer to think the way a human being thinks? But about 3 years into the program, I realized that it really raises a lot of philosophical questions. Like, a human mind can make up its own mind. It can make its own decisions. It has free will. Well, can I get a computer to have free will? Well, computers don't have free will because they're just programmed. They do whatever you program them to do. That's kind of interesting. We can do things that computers can't. But I don't really believe there's like a God in the world. I don't believe in any kind of spiritual thing. It struck me as a little strange. Human beings have a thing called consciousness, self-awareness. Computers don't have self-awareness. They're just machines. They're just a bunch of chemicals. They're just a bunch of wires. So this kind of questioning really led me much more in the area of philosophy. And it got me to realize that science really has a lot of areas, biology, physics, the newer areas of physics, artificial intelligence, where they hit a bit of a wall. They don't have answers. They still don't have answers 20, 30 years later. And I think the presumption is, one day we'll find the answers to these questions. Anyway, that's what basically led me towards Judaism. I obviously was born Jewish, but I explored Judaism. And I think probably the most interesting thing for me was that Judaism presented itself as, a whole system of belief that didn't really require a leap of faith. That's what I was looking for. I wasn't interested in a rabbi saying, listen, here's what you're supposed to believe. We can't explain why. It doesn't have to make any sense. Just accept it. It's not a Jewish idea. Judaism says that you're supposed to approach the questions of how we look at life, how we understand the idea of a God, and God giving us a book of instructions, that you can actually approach those ideas rationally. You can approach them rationally. So one of the big areas where that becomes a question is the area of science and Torah. In other words, science clearly looks at the world one way. Torah, when you start to look at it, seems to have a very different picture. In other religions, you might say, listen, you just have to have faith or just assume that the scientists are all wrong and the believers are all right. But as Jews, what we want to say is not like that. We want to say, listen, we know that God created the world. And God gave us this thing called Torah. So if God is the author of both Torah and the world, they have to match each other. There can't be a contradiction between what you understand through the natural sciences and what you understand through this book called Torah, because they come from the same source. So Maimonides has a famous statement. Maimonides says, he wrote this already in the 1100s, Maimonides says, anytime you find a clash, a contradiction between science and Torah, it's one of two possibilities. Either you're not reading Torah properly, or you're not understanding science properly. Either the scientists got it wrong, or those who are telling you what Torah says are getting it wrong. Because in principle, you can't really have a contradiction. So that's sort of the starting point for this class. I want to look at the areas where people talk about conflicts, people talk about clashes, and let's see if we can be rational, not having to take any kind of leap of faith, and see if we can actually resolve the problems. Sound good? Any questions so far?
You do have to take a leap of faith. If you say, like, people who don't understand the Torah properly, you were saying that the Torah, that the leap of faith is that the Torah is, perfect. So the people are wrong on the Torah, but that's a leap of faith you have to do.
Well, I wouldn't call it a leap of faith. I would say, if science is saying one thing and Torah is saying something else, I want to dig deeply enough into both to see if I can find an area where they don't contradict. I don't want to be satisfied by saying, okay, I guess the scientists are just wrong, or I guess we just don't understand Torah properly. I'd say, no, let's dig deeper. Let's be as intelligent and honest as we can to make sure science really knows what they're talking about, and that we understand Torah properly, what it's saying. And let's still see if there's any contradictions. So we'll see. I think by the end of the class, you'll see At no point am I going to say, listen, just accept it, that's the way it is, you're not supposed to understand these things. So we'll see as we go through. So let's start like this. In your own minds, maybe we'll actually write them on the board. In your own minds, where would you think that there is some contradiction between science and Torah, science and religion? Where's an area where you think there's a conflict of some sort? This is an interesting question to ask an American audience. Who's the first man who was ever in outer space? Right, so you're not even American and you said that. Where are you from?
South Africa.
South Africa, right?
It wasn't. He was second.
Very good. So all of the Americans think it was Neil Armstrong because he's the first man on the moon. Who's the? Very good. Wow, Rabbi. Yuri Gagarin was a Russian cosmonaut, first man in outer space. Now, he grew up in Russia, right? Atheist, communist Russia. He's the first man in outer space. I forget, he was traveled, satellited around the Earth a few times, came back down, and the world was waiting with bated breath to see what he's going to say. He's coming back down. First man ever in outer space, beyond gravity, seeing the whole universe out there. It's amazing. He came down, decompression chamber for a couple of days, doctor's tests. They finally got him in front of a camera, worldwide audience. Gagarin, what do you say? What was your experience in outer space? So the first thing he said was, I spent 3 days orbiting the planet. I looked all around at all the stars and all the galaxies, and I can tell you, I didn't see God anywhere. There's no God, right? Because science says, well, listen, I want to understand the world in scientific terms. God, I don't see God. No telescope shows me God, so I don't think there's a God. But science won't be able to say things about the world to come or about spirituality or about, because it's already beyond the bounds of what science even allows itself to talk about. I'd say there's one more major area of distinction, which is the question of age of the universe. Age of the universe. According to science today, again, I don't mean the age of Earth, but the age of the universe itself. According to science, roughly what scientists say today, approximately how old the universe is?
14.8.
Very good, 14.8 billion years old. Right? And according to Judaism, how old is the world? What year are we in now according to the Jewish calendar? 57? 57 something, right? 5776. That's the year we're in right now, right? And that's a pretty huge difference. Is it billions of years old? Is it thousands of years old? An obvious question. So creation, evolution, age of the universe, I'm for sure going to have time to talk about tonight. We'll see how much time we have. If we can get to the question of miracles, I'd love to as well. But let's see if we can do it. Let's start with creation, because creation for me is the easiest and maybe the most interesting one, and it's very short. We have a Torah that says, in the beginning. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now that statement is really saying two ideas that were very, very difficult for most of world civilization to believe in. One is the idea that there's a God who created it. Most of the world is not monotheist for most of history. The idea that there is a God that created it, but even more so, the idea that there's even a thing called creation was a very foreign idea for much of the world. All of Greek metaphysics is based on this idea that the world had no beginning. It's been around forever and ever. Right? All the Greek stories talk about this world that's been around. There's the famous story of Aristophanes. The philosopher Aristophanes. Story goes that the students come to Aristophanes one day and they ask him, they say, Aristophanes, you look at the whole world, everything we see, we seem to be hanging in the air over here. Like, what's keeping everything up? So Aristophanes said, my sons, this world is being held up by the great Greek god Atlas. Atlas is holding the world on his shoulders. Right? You've all seen the statue of Atlas on his shoulders, right? Atlas is holding the whole world on his shoulders. So the students say, but Aristophanes, if Atlas is holding up everything, what's the obvious question? Then what's holding up Atlas? So Aristophanes says, Atlas is standing on the back of a giant turtle. Okay, but then what's the turtle standing on? The turtle is standing on the back of another turtle. But what's that turtle standing on? Another turtle. What about that one? Aristophanes says, it's turtles all the way down. There's no beginning. There's no starting point. The world is not billions of years old. It's not quadrillions of years old. It's infinitely old. It had no beginning. Time goes on forever and ever and ever into the past. That was a Greek belief that became a pervasive idea in most of Western civilization. Comes along Maimonides in the 1200s and says, listen, if our Torah says in the beginning, it's the first word, Bereshit, there was a thing called the beginning. The Greeks say it's been around forever. Our Torah says, no, there was a distinct moment called the beginning. The world has a beginning point. Before that, there was nothing, and God created something out of nothing. So Maimonides goes ahead, and in his book, Guide to the Perplexed, very difficult book to read. For most people, it makes you more perplexed, not less. But in his book, Guide to the Perplexed, what he does is gives a logical proof, a very complex but elegant logical proof why the world had to have a beginning. How we can show logically that there's no way the Greeks are right. The world had to start at a certain point. Has to have a certain size, has to have a certain shape, has to have a beginning point in time. It's a whole elaborate proof we're not going to get into now for a simple reason. Because even though Maimonides proved it, most of the world didn't accept the Jewish view. Most of the world didn't believe in the idea of a beginning. Most of the physics didn't believe in the idea of a beginning. The physicists until the 1920s didn't believe in the idea of a beginning. Comes along finally Edwin Hubble in the 1920s, invents this very powerful telescope, looks around the world, and sees that the whole world, everything in the world is all moving away from each other. All the galaxies are receding away from each other. He makes a few calculations. He realizes that can only be possible if it started at a certain point. There has to have been a beginning. So he comes up with this idea that there must have been a beginning to the universe. It's the 1920s. The 1930s, 40s, and 50s, they keep investigating this question. 60s and 70s, they start experimenting with it. And in the 1970s, scientists come along and prove this thing called the Big Bang. The Big Bang, the whole idea of the Big Bang is the world had a beginning. Not just our planet, the entire universe of space and time had a beginning. And they calculate based on how things are moving away from it and how far they are. They do redshift calculations. They work backwards to understand retroactively when it could have started. Their calculation is 14.8 billion years. But what they're saying is there was a beginning. So for thousands of years, right, you look at this first question, was there a beginning or there wasn't there? For thousands of years, we've been saying it, not just as a point of faith, but as a point of logic. Maimonides is saying, we can prove there was a beginning. The world said, no such thing. We don't believe in your logic. And until the 1970s, the world finally came around and realized, oh, there was a beginning. I guess we were wrong on that one. So this is an argument that we basically won hands down. There's nobody in the world today that studies science that believes that the world goes on forever and ever into the past. It's scientifically impossible. So that's the argument that we could say hands down is an easy one for us to win. I'll tell you that you're familiar with the name Richard Dawkins? Heard of Richard Dawkins, right? Famous evolutionary biologist, probably the biggest anti-religious crusader in the world today. I've read many of his books. I'm familiar with his writings. Seen a lot of his YouTube debates. So when I was studying philosophy in university, we're going back a long time now, 35 years ago. Okay, I'm an old guy. I've got 2 grandchildren. I'm an old man. Okay, 35 years ago, when I was in university studying philosophy. So Richard Dawkins wasn't around. He was a kid. He's older than me, but okay, he was a bigger kid than me. But his predecessor, the big atheist crusader of his day, was a professor by the name of Antony Flew, an English philosopher, scientist named Antony Flew, F-L-E-W. You can look him up online. He's written over 30 books proving atheism. In the 1980s, 1990s, late 1990s, he started looking more carefully at the evidence of the idea of the Big Bang and the idea of a beginning. He realized that the evidence has changed so much. Science has progressed so much since the 1960s and 70s that he came out with his final book. He was already 80-something years old. It was a worldwide press conference. I saw the headline in the paper. Antony Flew, after writing 30 books on atheism, comes out and says, I realize I was wrong. There actually is a God. So he wrote one last book and then died 2 years later. He died, I think, just last year. He did Tshuva right at the end. He just got it in. His book was called There Is a God. I would say better, There Is a God, as he say it. And the subtitle is How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind. And he writes at the beginning of the book, he says, I started re-examining these questions and looking at the idea of a beginning. He says, I heard about a fellow in Jerusalem, an Orthodox Jewish scholar by the name of Dr. Gerald Schroeder. Happens to be a good friend of mine. He teaches with me at Torah in Jerusalem. He's written many books about science and Torah. Most of what I'm going to say tonight is really his theories, not mine. I heard about this fellow, Dr. Gerald Schroeder. I flew him over to England. We sat for hours and talked, and I realized I was wrong. There is a God. So what did I do as soon as I read that headline? I was shocked. I remember studying him when he was an atheist. I said, I got to go online to his website and see what all of his followers are saying now. He's got a whole, it's like Dawkins today has a whole following of all of his Talmidim, all of his followers that believe in. So I want to see what Anthony Fleur's followers are saying. So what are they all saying? They're saying, no, it's a fake headline. It's an April Fool's joke. There's no way. He's been an atheist his whole life. There's no way he changed his mind. Oh, it's not an April Fool's joke. It wasn't April 1st. He really does believe in God. So their current theory is he was old. He was in his 80s. And there's two theories among the students. One is that he just became senile, and that's why he believes in God. The other is that he's just worried that just in case there is heaven, I'll hedge my bets. I'll say I believe. So I don't know where Anthony Fleur is now, but I'm sure he's smiling at us and enjoying this conversation. Okay, so on this question of creation, it's a non-issue anymore. We said it in Torah 3,300 years ago. The world didn't believe it. Maimonides proved it 1,000 years ago. People still didn't believe it. Science finally in the 1970s said it. And today we know that this is clearly, we're on the winning side on this one.
Who created it?
So that's an interesting question. So the simple answer is this. The simple answer is, if we're saying that everything in the entire physical universe started with one point of energy, right? That's what they call the singularity, one point of energy, and the entire universe was all packed into this dense point of energy, all of finite existence, then you'd have to ask one simple question. If everything, where did this thing come from? It came from a piece of wood. Where did the wood come? It came from a tree. Where did the tree come from? Well, it came from a seed. So where did the seed come from? Well, it came from another tree. Everything in this world is cause and effect. Everything in this world, we come from our parents, we come from their parents. Even if you go with evolution and say, well, we came from the monkeys, we came from the frogs, we came from the worms, we came from the cells, whatever. Everything is cause and effect. So if you look at this one thing that was the beginning point of all of finite existence, you'd have to ask a simple question. Where did it come from? The answer can't be something else finite and physical made it, because this is the beginning of all physicality. So I think the only logical possibility is if that's the beginning of finite, it must have been created by something that's called infinite. When we use the word God, God sounds like a very religious word, but the word God, all we mean is an infinite, unlimited source beyond time and space that created a physical world. That's all we mean by God. So, and that Maimonides actually makes that point as well. Because there's a beginning, there must be a beginner. Because the beginning is finite, the beginner must be infinite. It's a logical way of approaching the idea that there must be a God, essentially. I'll tell you again, just another quick story is, the names of the two fellows who won the Nobel Prize for discovering DNA?
Watson and Crick.
Very good, Watson and Crick. James Watson and Francis Crick. They won the Nobel Prize in the 1960s for discovering DNA. So I read a Time magazine article that interviewed them after they won the prize. They interviewed Dr. Watson, and they said, you discovered DNA, Nobel Prize, fantastic, what do you think? So Watson says, when you look at DNA, you see how complex it is. Like, every cell of your body has a blueprint for your whole body, the whole genetic code, the double helix. He says, it is so complex. He says, it's a sign of God. Only God could make something as complex as DNA. Now, it happens to be that James Watson is a Christian. He believes in God anyway. So for him, it's a pretty obvious thing. He's like, look at DNA. DNA must have come from God. Simple. Then they interviewed Dr. Crick. Now, Dr. Crick happens to be an atheist. So they asked Dr. Crick, what do you think about DNA? He says, it's amazing. It's so complex. It's so sophisticated. It's fantastic. They say, according to your colleague, Dr. Watson, only God could make something as complex as DNA. What do you say to that? He says, I'm an atheist. I don't believe in God. I don't think God made DNA. I don't believe in God altogether. So the interviewer says, okay, then did it just get there on its own somehow? He says, don't be ridiculous. Even if the world's been around for billions of years, there's no way something as complex as DNA could ever form by accident. It's impossible. The interviewer says, okay, if it didn't get there on its own, and God didn't make it, then where did DNA come from? So here's his answer. I actually memorized it because I loved his answer. His answer is, to me, the only plausible explanation for DNA is it must have been created by aliens in outer space. That's what he said. He wrote 3 books since then on his theory that aliens in other galaxies created DNA in a laboratory, flew through wormholes and black holes, came to our galaxy, came to planet Earth, seeded the planet with DNA, and we all sprouted out of the DNA. He really believes it. It's called, that was the name of his theory, it's called transspermia. That's the name of his theory, okay? Look up on Wikipedia, it's amazing. But I would say this, just back to Ben's question. If I was the one interviewing Dr. Crick, and he says, I don't think God made DNA, I don't think it got there by itself, I have a better answer. It came from the aliens. What's the next obvious question you'd have to ask Dr. Crick? Who made the aliens? Where do they come from? You haven't really solved the problem here. You're looking at something that you can't explain, so you say, oh, I get it. Something else I can't explain must have made it. Okay, where did that one come from? Well, maybe something else. Okay, then you're back to the turtle problem. It just goes on forever and ever. Something had to get the whole thing started. So that's really why we say creation is a logical proposition that I don't think anybody today can argue out of. Number 2, evolution. This is a much more contentious issue, right? Creationism, evolution, the whole debate in high schools in America today. Should we teach creationism? Should we teach, what do they call it? There's a name for it, intelligent design, right? How do we approach this question of evolution? So to me, it comes down to one pretty simple idea, that the basis of how we would look at it logically is to say this. Let's understand exactly what the claim of evolution actually is. What are they claiming? They're claiming like this. They're saying you have a species of animal that exists. As a rule within nature, when an animal gives birth to its offspring, there's always some level of variation, genetic mutation in the offspring, right? The baby dog is going to grow up to be maybe a little taller or a little faster or a little fatter or a little thinner than its parents. There's always some level of genetic mutation, of variation. Now, if it happens to be that the offspring has an advantage, it's a little faster or a little stronger or a little heavier, it can survive the winter better. If it happens to have an advantageous mutation, it's more likely to survive and pass on that mutation to the next generation, right? I remember growing up, all the textbooks in school were, giraffes with short necks. This one giraffe has a longer neck. It can eat the fruit that's higher on the tree. It's more likely to survive over the shorter giraffes. And if that repeats itself thousands and thousands of times over billions of years, or millions of years, you'll end up having, by accident, this process of giraffes naturally ending up growing longer necks, right? Not because the giraffe is trying to grow a longer neck. It's just the law of averages. There's enough mutations and random mutations that would allow for that. So the whole basis of evolution is really just saying that you can have enough random mutations that would survive, that eventually you'll end up with a simple species of animal slowly evolving into a complex, advanced species of animal. Worms will eventually turn into frogs. Again, not turn into, but through many iterations over millions and millions of years. Worms turning into frogs, frogs turning into fish turning into mammals, mammals turning into humans, eyes, brains, hands, legs, the whole thing. So really, if that's true, then the analogy they use is this, the famous analogy in the world of evolution is this. Theoretically, if you took 1 million monkeys and you gave every monkey a laptop to bang away on, and you gave those monkeys 1 million years to just bang away on these computers, right? 1 million monkeys for 1 million years typing away on computers, just randomly hitting the keys. They don't know what they're doing, randomly hitting the keys. Would you be surprised if eventually, after 1 million years, one of the monkeys, purely by accident, typed out to be or not to be? That is the question. Would that shock you? Yeah. It shouldn't. There's so many monkeys typing for so long in so many places. He got lucky once. He's not a smart monkey. He doesn't know what he's typing. It's not like he read Shakespeare. There's just so many monkeys doing it for so long. You would expect something like that to happen. So the argument in evolution is, listen, the world's been around for billions of years. There's hundreds of billions of galaxies. There's billions of opportunities for life to evolve and mutate randomly. Eventually, somehow, somewhere, we'll get lucky enough that we'll end up having a complex species of animals like humans or any other lower form of species of animals. It'll just happen by accident. If that's the claim of evolution, which it is, then this whole thing really boils down to one basic question. What are the odds? I can calculate what are the odds of 100 monkeys typing for 100 years and typing Shakespeare. It's a 1 in a billion chance. 1,000 monkeys typing for 1,000 years, okay, it's a little bit better. 1,000,000 monkeys for millions, now it becomes reasonable. But the evolutionist has to face the fact that the world's been only around for 14 billion years. It's not all that long for some really wild, random things to happen. There's only a few 100 billion galaxies around for this random stuff to even take place. So all you have to do is ask the evolutionist a simple question. According to you and your theory of evolution, what are the odds that this actually did happen? Ask any evolutionist, ask Richard Dawkins this question, ask any evolutionist the question, what are the odds that life would eventually evolve purely by accident somewhere in the history of the universe at some point in time? Okay, you've got 14 billion years to play with, you've got hundreds of billions of galaxies to work with, lots of places to experiment and roll dice and have monkeys typing here. What are the odds that somehow, somewhere, at some point, a life-reproducing cell will come into existence out of the soup of enzymes that are floating around the universe? What are the odds of it happening by chance? So the evolutionists themselves will give you the following number.
So what's the question?
What are the odds of one cell of life coming into existence randomly just from all the compounds floating around in the universe? Right? You got 14 billion years to play with, you got hundreds of billion galaxies for it to happen. What are the odds of it happening anywhere, anytime in the history of the universe? They will say, their number is, the odds, and we're not talking about a human being, one cell. The odds of a cell coming into existence just randomly, somewhere, sometime in the history of the universe, are odds of 1 in a billion. That doesn't mean 2 billion. That already means a billion times a billion, right? So we're already up to 18 zeros here, right? 1 in a billion, 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 billion. Billion, 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 billion.
How many zeros?
304 zeros. 1 in 10 to the power of 304. Okay? It would take a lot of boards to write all those numbers out, and my voice would go bad a long time before that. Right? Those are the odds of it happening. Now, imagine if I asked you to pick a number from 1 to just a billion. I say, you know what? I can predict, I can read your mind. Pick a number from 1 to a billion. So you think of a number, and I say, I know your number. You're thinking of the number 349,269,378. You say, oh my gosh, how did you do that? There's a 1 in a billion chance. That's crazy. And then watch me do it 304 more times. And then say, oh, you just got lucky. That's the odds of evolution. It sounds crazy. Now, when I came across it, I said, this doesn't make any sense. You know why it doesn't make sense? Because scientists are smart people. They should know better than to bet on odds like that. Why do scientists believe in evolution when the odds of it being true just seem so crazy? It's like the scientists looking at me guessing all these billion-dollar guesses and saying, okay, you got lucky 304 times. It just sounds ridiculous. So I'll tell you once, I was once on a college campus teaching a class on this idea. No, I wasn't actually. I was teaching a class. I was doing an open question and answer session for a group of college students. And this one girl innocently asked me the question. She says, listen, what do Orthodox Jews think about evolution? So I told her, I said, this is what we think about it. This is what they say, and that's why I don't believe it. She says, Rabbi, that's ridiculous. That's not the odds of evolution happening. I said, how do you know? She says, because I'm doing my master's degree right now in evolutionary biology. That's not the odds of it happening. I said, oh, okay, I didn't know. Sorry, I misunderstood. So what is the odds? She said, I don't know, but it can't be that, because then nobody would be studying evolution. I said, so you know what? Maybe I am wrong. Tell me what you find out. Go back to campus, go back to your professor, tell me what they say. So I didn't hear from her. She took my email down. I didn't hear from her for about 2 months. She writes me an email 2 months later. She says, Rabbi, I was on campus today doing my degree, evolution biology, and the professor in class said, today we're going to study that magical moment when the first cell of life came into existence. So she says, I asked the professor, what do you mean that magical moment? Professor says it was just an amazing coincidence that all the right elements were there at the right time in the right place to make a cell that's reproducible come into existence. So she says, I asked the professor, so, I mean, when you say it's unlikely, like, what are the odds of it happening? The professor looks at me and says, what do you mean, what are the odds? I don't know the odds. It happened. Let's go on. So she went up to the professor after the class and said, listen, I want to understand it. Can you tell me, what does it take for a cell to come into existence randomly, anywhere, anytime in the history of the universe? He didn't want to discuss it. She said, no, I want you to tell me. She said she sat with the professor for half an hour. This is all in the email she sent me. She said, I sat with the professor for half an hour. We worked at all the numbers and looked at all the possibilities, calculated all the, and we came up to some crazy number with hundreds and hundreds of zeros. So she says, I turned to the professor and I said, I don't get it. It really is that unlikely? Then why do you still believe in evolution? It doesn't make any sense. So the professor said, I'm a scientist. In the world of science, without bringing God into the picture, this is the best answer we have. So at the end of the email, she says, Rabbi, I'm coming to Jerusalem in December. I'm going to check out seminary and come to learn Torah for a while. She never finished the program. She dropped out right then and there.
How do you explain that there are still these animals?
There are still
Monkeys and giraffes.
Well, because once an animal is adaptable to its environment, you won't, in our lifetime, you won't see evolution, right? Evolution happens so slowly that for a species to evolve to a different species, you'd have to be around for hundreds of thousands of years to see any kind of real evolution. So, we would say like this, on a micro level, do we find examples of evolution within a species of animal? You certainly see examples. Darwin proved it. Darwin showed examples of animals, birds that developed slowly stronger beaks in the Galapagos Islands because they were more able to crack the nuts and survive the birds with the weaker beaks. You definitely see examples of it on a micro level. You can say that fruit flies will develop stronger wings over 7 or 8 generations. You'll say that polar bears, when it gets warmer, when it gets colder outside, over several generations will give birth to animals that are thinner, that are less fat deposits. That happens naturally. But to say that an animal can actually evolve into a completely different species is mathematically impossible. And there's no fossil record anywhere. There's hundreds of thousands of fossils we found. There's no fossils anywhere that show any kind of an actual development of one species of animal evolving into a different species. So why are there still monkeys? Because monkeys can hang out being monkeys. There's no threat to their existence as monkeys. They don't have to evolve to stick around. They're doing fine in the jungles and the zoos and wherever we have monkeys. Okay, let's move on to the next point. So evolution, I think, is also, to me, a pretty straightforward point. I want to skip this one for now. We'll come back. It's a little bit more of a philosophical point. Let's move on to age of the universe. It's going to get a little interesting here. So here we have, like I said, we've got a basic contradiction. On the one hand, science says 14.8 billion years, Torah says 57.76, right? Huge disparity between the two. This is not my own idea. I'm literally lifting this idea directly from Dr. Gerald Schroeder, a colleague of mine in...
Going back to the original, I'm not sure, what's the Jewish answer?
On which?
On evolution.
So Jewish answer is, we don't believe that things, could God have made a world look like it had evolved? God could have done it. But to say that it happened randomly on its own, the way science says, is basically impossible. It's basically impossible. So age of the universe, this is an idea directly from Dr. Gerald Schroeder. He's written 5 books on the topic. He travels around the world speaking about it. He has a double PhD in nuclear physics and oceanography, whatever that is, I don't know, from MIT. He's a very well world-renowned, recognized expert in the sciences. And he wrote a whole theory that explains this idea of age of the universe I'm going to share with you now. Here's the basic problem. Science says 14.8 billion years. We say 57.76. So the way we're going to approach it is this. That when we say it's 57.76, that's how old the universe is, for us, when does the clock change to the next year? When do we start, in the Christian calendar it's January 1st. When do we change our clocks? When do we go to the next year? 1st of Tishrei, Rosh Hashanah, right? Beginning of the Jewish New Year. Is the beginning of the Jewish New Year the commemoration of when God created the universe? What are we actually commemorating on Rosh Hashanah? The creation of man and woman, right? Adam and Eve were created on day 6. And when we count the calendar, we're really counting 1st of Tishrei as day 6. So in a sense, the actual age of the universe is 57.76 which is from the 6th day of creation. You'd have to add on to that the other 5.5 days, meaning the first 5 days, day 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where there was no man, and halfway into day 6, until Adam and Eve were actually created, right? That doesn't give us a lot, doesn't help us too much, but you have 76, but technically speaking, plus another 5.5 days.
How do we know that we start counting the earth?
Only from Torah. I mean, the Torah gives us the idea that Rosh Hashanah commemorates the date of Adam being born. That's how we understand it to be. It's the day of judgment, because that's the day God created Adam. So every year God revisits his creation, looks at human beings, judges them again, comes back to see us again, that type of thing. So here's the question. Dr. Schroeder says, when we say the world is 14.8 billion years old, we have to understand one fundamental idea. When they make this calculation, they're making it based on a human, earth-based understanding of how time flows in the universe. Now, what did Einstein come along in the 1920s and prove? This idea called the theory of relativity. Right? We've all heard of it before. Most of us have never spent time thinking about it too much. What is the theory of relativity actually saying? A fascinating idea. The theory of this has nothing to do with Torah. The theory of relativity says that how quickly or slowly time flows depends on who's observing the flow of time. If you're in an area of the universe with a high gravitational pull, time itself literally slows down. Okay? You're in an area with a very light gravitational pull, gravitational field, time itself literally speeds up. And that sounds a little weird to us. It's not hard to understand, but Einstein's idea, his example was this. Einstein's example was, if I'm on Earth, imagine I could use a telescope and see people on Jupiter. Okay? Imagine there's people on Jupiter, which is a massive planet. It's a much heavier gravitational pull than Earth's is, because it's a much bigger planet. If I could see people on Jupiter playing a game of tennis, I'm watching it from Earth. So the way it would look to me, the people on Jupiter playing tennis, is like this. And it would take 5 minutes just for me to swing my racket. It would take another 8 minutes for the whole ball to get us to go across the net. If you're the one on Jupiter playing the game, it's a normal game of tennis, because you're relative to your own time frame. But looking at it from Earth, where time flows differently over there, it looks much slower. 6 sets of tennis would take 12 years. They're not playing for 12 years on their time, it's just regular time. If I was on Earth looking at people on Mercury playing a game of tennis, okay, it's pretty hot over there, can't play tennis too well, but let's say theoretically, people on Mercury is a very small planet, much less gravitational pull, the whole game of tennis goes by in 5 minutes. 6 sets of tennis in 5 minutes. It goes by so fast you can't even see the ball flying. Again, if you're the one on Mercury playing, it feels and looks like a normal game of tennis. But from an Earth perspective, time there goes much faster, time there goes much slower. The actual rate and flow of time changes. It's been proven, it's a theory that Einstein came up with. It's been proven scientifically to be true. We don't even call it anymore a theory, we call it the law of relativity. We all know it to be the case. So Dr. Schroeder says, okay, when we say the world is 14.8 billion years old, what do we mean? From an Earth-based perspective, that's how old the universe is. When we on Earth look at how quickly the planets are receding away from each other, the Earth-based calculation we make is that the world is 14.8 billion years old. But if I was on Jupiter measuring the age of the universe, I might conclude the world is only a few million years old. If I was on Mercury measuring the age of the universe, where time flows completely different there, I might conclude the world is 50 trillion years old, or 50 quadrillion years old. I mean, the number 14.8 billion is a very relative number. That's why it's called theory of relativity. It's a very relative number to who's observing it. So Dr. Schroeder says this. He says, once Adam appears on Earth, it makes sense that the Torah is going to describe time from an Earth-based perspective. But before that, in these 5.5 days, when God's creating the universe, there's no man, there's no people, there's no human observer. Until man gets created at the end of 5.5 days, Earth is no more special of a place to measure time from than any other planet or any other galaxy. It's just another arbitrary place to measure time, and time will change depending on who's measuring it. So he says, what would happen if we tried to calculate these 14.8 billion years, not from an Earth perspective, but from a universal perspective? Let's say you could be God, standing outside of the universe and looking at the whole universe From the moment of the Big Bang, it explodes, it expands, time slows down. It expands more, time slows down even more. If you had to factor in how time flows in the whole universe until day 6, until 5.5 days when Adam gets created, how much time would actually pass? So he says it's a very simple calculation. It's 14,800,000,000 years. Okay? Any physics journal will tell you that if you look at the initial conditions of the universe when it first exploded, you can actually measure how much gravitational energy was there. And by knowing how much gravitational energy is there, you can calculate what the factor is that you have to divide this by to know the actual flow of time in the universe. It turns out, according to most journals, you'd have to divide this number, right? This is 14.8 billion years. You'd have to divide this by a factor of 1 trillion. Okay? Divided by a factor of 1 trillion is what takes it out of being Earth-based time to universal time. When you make this calculation, you end up getting 14.8 divided by 1,000. Sorry, I'm going to move down here, which is 0.00148 years. The actual age of the universe, not from an Earth perspective, but from a universe perspective, is 0.00148 years. If you want to know how many days that comes out to, you multiply by 365 days. Calculation comes out to be approximately 5.5 days. Exactly the same, 5.3 days. NASA hasn't got it straight yet. They'll figure it out one day. It's close to 5.3, 5.25, something like that. It's almost exactly the same 5.5 days that we talk about here. So this is not us trying to apologize and say the Torah really is saying what science said. It's saying that never mind science is catching up with Torah. Torah's been saying the answer all along. We just didn't know how to calculate it. We needed modern science to tell us how to make the calculations. But when the Torah says 6 days and then the rest of the years, it's exactly what science has come to discover.
Is there anything in Torah that implies or hints at this change in perspective? I mean, I understand what you're saying. Until man was created, there's no logical reason why it should be going through. But, is there anything that...
It's just logical. Meaning, it's God. You have to realize those first 6 days until Adam's around, it's God describing creation, right? He's the one writing it. He's the one. So I made this, I made that. This will be good, this will be good. Then I parted the heavens, then I made the fish, then I made... It's all God talking. Once you have day 6 that Adam is around, now we shift into understanding of very human, right? The whole rest of Torah, after those first 28 verses, is just humans. Adam did this, Eve did this, Cain and Abel did this. Everybody you will find who's really qualified in both fields, they're the ones who are saying there's no contradictions. The only people who find contradictions are the ones who don't understand one side of the equation. Once you understand both sides, there's no doubts, there's no problems. It actually all makes a lot of sense. Okay? Thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yeah, I'm around if you have any other questions. I'm happy to.
No.
Isn't it true that some rabbis actually say that scientists finding out that what was written in the Gemara 2,000 years ago are actually making sense to maybe what they're finding out in this day and age?
Definitely. Yeah.
We're 2,000 years ahead of all science.
Yeah. Look, there's a lot of cases where that hasn't happened yet, but there's plenty of cases where it has. There's actually one place in the Gemara in Brachot where the Gemara actually gives a calculation of how many stars, galaxies there are in the universe. And it's this astronomical number of billions and billions and billions of galaxies. And I think anybody even in those times would have said, you look at the sky, you don't see that many stars, a few hundred, a few thousand. And only really in the 80s and 90s when NASA started making calculations of how many stars there actually are, it's very, very close to the number that the Talmud said 1,500 years ago. So there's a bunch of examples. There's medical things, there's things about anatomy, things about cosmology, astronomy, that to this day science is finding out the Torah actually said a long, long time ago.
Wasn't Torah something, quote, how many species of fish there were or something? Which how would they have known that?
Right, so it's not even how many, it's more that the Torah, actually here the Talmud makes a very odd statement. Talmud says, you won't find any aquatic animals that have fins without having scales. No such thing.
Yeah.
Said that 2,000 years ago. No such thing as an animal that has fins with no scales. Doesn't exist. And therefore, if you find an animal that has scales, you know it must have fins, so it's a kosher animal. It's a Mishnah. The Mishnah says it. So, since that time, we've discovered about 25,000 species of fish. And to this day, there's no example that breaks that rule. So you have to think, like, which rabbi in the times of the Mishnah, in the year 200 CE, could have possibly known that information? They just took a guess? Why make such a definitive statement about biology when you know you haven't seen half the animals in the waters yet? You're making a statement that if it ever gets disproven, you realize you just look like an idiot that doesn't understand the world. You become totally discredited. So there's a number of things like that where we look and we say, these aren't just smart rabbis. These rabbis must have the information they're getting is definitely coming from a higher source, because there's no other way they could possibly have known it. There's a whole bunch of examples like that.
But are there quite a few places where we've got it wrong? So on the converse that we've said something that's kind of it's been...
That's a good question. So there are cases where the Talmud will give, let's say, recipes for medicinal cures for things that we look today and say, they just don't work. So I think there's two possibilities. One is that the plants and the herbs that they were talking about are just not the same as they were once upon a time. What they had back then, thousands of years of change, evolutionary change, environmental change, might have changed the chemical properties. To me, the other possibility, and not all rabbis will agree with me. If I say it, Rabbi Goodnight might never want me back here again. I'm willing to say that sometimes when the rabbis are giving medicinal cures, they're just borrowing the information from the local culture, right? In the local culture of Babylon, they believe that this kind of root is good for stomach aches. They're not saying that God said it is. That's what the locals used to believe. So that's what they used to use as a cure. We look back now and say, no, it just doesn't work. It was a superstition or whatever. We found better cures now. So when the rabbis are making statements in the name of God or in the name of an actual Jewish tradition, I'm going to take them seriously. When they're making statements about their observation of the world around them or medicine or whatever it is, and they're just saying, look, as human beings, here's what we think cures these diseases. It's the best we got. We got it from the Greeks. We got it from the Babylonians. It doesn't bother me that those rabbis could be wrong, because they're not talking about anything spiritual. They're not talking about anything that came from God. They're making observations of the world. It's like you will read writings of rabbis. I was fascinated when I saw this. Writings of rabbis in the 1950s in America that said, it is highly recommended for your health that after you eat a meal, you should always have a cigarette. Helps with your digestion and the blood flow. Why were the rabbis saying that? Because that's what the doctors were saying. Nobody knew that cigarettes were causing cancer. The medical world at the time thought that cigarettes were actually good for you. They didn't know about any negative side effects. So the rabbis are just, going along with what the doctors tell them. We don't have any secret wisdom about cigarettes that doctors don't have. So it doesn't surprise me that rabbis, when they're using scientific information that's contemporary to their time, might make the same mistakes that the scientists are making. But the point is, they're not saying anything in the name of God. So it's not really a corruption or a question on what the ideas of Torah come from. Yeah.
Last question, sorry. What about paranormal activity and the soul and that kind of thing? I mean, how is science, how does Torah...
That's totally that's my wife's topic, not me.
Yeah.
My wife's family's from India. They're really into this stuff. My family's from Russia. We're not into this. We have a lot of interesting discussions about these things. So I'll tell you this. When I hear today, these days, about rabbis that can see the future, or rabbis that predicted things that were going to happen, or rabbis that can see into your soul, I'm always a little skeptical. I'm never, there was a video going around on YouTube last month about an Israeli boy that died and came back to life. I don't know if it was a whole 2-hour video, was it? It was in Hebrew. This 15-year-old kid, totally not religious, that died, came back to life, and says, I saw Rav Moshe Feinstein, and I saw this rabbi, and it was revealed to me that the end is coming soon, and Messiah is on his way, and had all these crazy things to say about the end of the world being on its way. I don't know. My wife loved it. Okay, not so much. I've rubbed off on her over the years. We married 25 years. I finally rubbed off on her. She rubbed off on me too. I'm a little skeptical about these things. I'm still by nature a scientist, kind of person. I've been trained a long time to think very skeptically and critically about things. So when the Talmud says it, I have enough belief in the credibility of the Talmud that I'll take it seriously. But some guy today is saying he had some paranormal experience. I'm not saying he didn't. I'm just saying I'm I'm not willing to bet money on it. I do hear some crazy stories sometimes about rabbis that can see things that is hard to imagine, that's for sure. I'll tell you this, I used to never believe in these stories that people had about life after death experiences. And then I read a book that my wife had in the house by an American MD named Raymond Moody. It was a secular American doctor, not Jewish or anything, who had a patient that died on the operating table, came back to life a few minutes later, described this whole, floating down the tunnel with the light and the wings and the whole thing. So I read it, I'm kind of like rolling my eyes like this is some crazy story. But this Raymond Moody went around the world interviewing lots of people that had life after death experiences, people in Russia, in China, in Africa, in Australia, and everybody described the exact same experience. So I started thinking so maybe there is, why would a 6-year-old Russian girl and a grandmother in Texas and some guy in an African tribe who's never seen a TV set, why would they all be describing the exact same experience after they died? There must be something going on up there that's actually true. Then when I started looking into Kabbalah, so Kabbalah describes the exact same scenarios, the exact same experiences that Raymond Moody, this doctor in America, found from interviewing people. So it was so consistent, and the stories all lined up so well. Okay, so that kind of twisted my arm into saying, I guess this whole life after death thing and the experiences people have, I guess they are legit. I'm willing to say. So I believe in life after death, but the idea of people having experiences, I became much more of a believer in it. Any other?
There's a quote by a rabbi called Rabbi Hidabroot, if you've heard of him.
Pattaya?
Yeah, maybe you've heard him. But he's like an exorcist, and he's actually been in situations where he's had to communicate with souls that have been inhabited with
Oh yeah?
people.
He's around now? He's a contemporary?
I recommend, because most rabbis don't recommend it, because it's a bit, each phrase you often bit and it's a bit.
They don't recommend doing it or reading the book?
Reading the book.
Reading the book,
I happen to be reading the book just because I heard about it, and I was sort of wanted to finish some sort of a book on the Zohar with I learned it on Shabbat, and in that sense I do believe in Gilgulim from what I read there, yeah.
So the Talmud talks about reincarnation. It talks about, what's the word in English? When a second soul enters an existing life, doesn't it? A person becomes possessed. I think that's the word, right? Become possessed by. There's an idea in the Talmud. I can't claim to fully understand it, that sometimes a person dies, their soul for some reason isn't able to enter into the next world. So their only way of existing is they force themselves into another person's body. And people have these double souls, multiple personalities. I saw something that shocked me. Actually, there's a
So if I seem a bit different next week.
There's a psychologist at Harvard named Tal Ben Shachar, an Israeli psychologist. He's actually in Israel now. So I did a little work with him a couple of years ago. He's fascinated by these things. He did a whole study on multiple personality disorders. I didn't know much about it. People have these situations where they literally completely change personalities to the degree where their eye color changes, their skin tone changes, their voice changes, their digestive system changes. Everything they become a literally completely different person. So, he's a bigger skeptic than I am. I said, listen, the Talmud talks about it. It's called having multiple souls. For some reason, a soul comes back in, and this person, it's two souls battling over one body. They both want to live in this world. And the soul actually changes the physical, people's eye color change. It's crazy. I can't claim to understand it, but it's been documented. So. Anyway, on that weird note, let's